Today we're going to read Albert Goes to Town. Albert loved cars, all cars. He liked race cars and dune buggies, police cars and vans. Albert had dozens of toy cars in all colors and all sizes. He raced them and parked them, he stacked them and admired them. But mostly, he wished that he could climb inside their tiny doors and drive them. For Albert's last birthday, Mr. Appleby from next door had taken a large board and built an entire village on it. Now Albert could steer his toy cars down a winding road, under a covered bridge, and past a green meadow. There were black and white cows in the meadow, and little wooden apples in the apple trees. And in the town, all sorts of houses were there. They all looked like the houses on Albert's own block. There was even one that looked like Mr. Appleby's house. Mr. Appleby lived in a tiny yellow house with a huge overgrown garden. In back, his old workshed was filled with tools and scraps of wood waiting to be turned into something wonderful. A birdhouse, a window box, toys. Mr. Appleby loved to make toys. One day, Albert tapped on the window of the shed. Mr. Appleby opened the door. "How's Albert today?" he said. "All right," Albert sighed. "Thank you for the town you made me for my cars." Mr. Appleby smiled. "You are very welcome, my friend," he said. "Just see that you enjoy it. Play with it a lot." "Oh, I do. I drive my cars around and around. I think it would be a wonderful place to visit." Albert paused. "I wish that I could drive there myself," he whispered. "That's what I truly wish." Instead of his wish, Albert got the flu. For nearly a week, he had to stay in bed and get plenty of rest. After that, when his fever was gone, he was allowed to sit in a big lawn chair outside in his backyard. He watched Mr. Appleby going in and out of his workshed. Albert waved. Mr. Appleby waved back. "I have a cold," Albert shouted. "I know," Mr. Appleby hollered back. "As soon as you're well enough, come on over. I've got a surprise for you." In the morning, after promising not to tire himself on his very first day out, Albert hurried next door. As he approached the workshed, he heard Mr. Appleby whistling. Albert peeked into the window. There, in the middle of the floor, stood the most beautiful wooden car. It was just Albert's size. It was a convertible with spoked wheels and one little seat. It had been polished so it glowed. Albert burst through the door, sending a cloud of sawdust through the sunbeams. "Is it this?" Albert cried. Is this my surprise?" "This here?" Mr. Appleby said, pointing to the car. "Oh, no, this isn't the surprise." The smile dropped from Albert's face like a stone. Oh, wait, the car, that's for you. But the real surprise is outside," Mr. Appleby told him. Albert eagerly helped Mr. Appleby push the little car outside. "Get in and try her out," Mr. Appleby said. Albert opened the door and slid onto the seat. He curled his fingers around the smooth wooden steering wheel and turned it back and forth. It was just like a real car. There were buttons and levers all in the right places. There was even gas and brake pedals on the floor. Albert smiled and reached inside the car. Mr. Appleby was right behind him. He pointed right there where there was a little wooden tiny key, and he turned it. The car made a clickety-clack sound, and Albert felt it spring to life all around him. Mr. Appleby pointed toward an opening in a big honeysuckle bush. "Take her for a spin," he said. Cautiously, Albert stepped on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. Quickly, he lifted his foot, and the car rolled to a stop. Mr. Appleby shouted, "Gotta give her some gas. Let her fly." Albert pushed hard on the pedal and ducked his head. He crashed through the sweet-smelling bushes, bumpity-clack. When he opened his eyes, he found himself cruising along the street in front of his house. He passed Mr. Appleby's house and the others on his block. As he turned the corner, he came upon a covered bridge that he didn't ever remember seeing before. Up ahead, the road was lined with shiny green grass and tall trees. Then he passed a large meadow. "Moo!" Albert shouted. He shouted to a herd of black and white cows. They didn't move back. He drove, and as he drove through the apple orchard, a perfectly red apple plopped into his lap. Around the next curve, Albert spotted his house. He noticed his mother standing on the front porch. "Hi, Mom," Albert called. "Look at me, I'm driving." Down the block, Mr. Appleby's cat was halfway up a tree with the Barker's dog, Ralph, close behind. Albert zoomed past, going faster and faster. The wind rushed by his ears and ruffled his hair. Albert passed cars and trucks of all kinds, lined up carefully along the road, but none were moving. They had no drivers. "Hi," Albert shouted to his mother as he turned onto his street again. Again, she seemed not to notice him. In fact, no one seemed to notice much of anything. Each time Albert passed, everyone was exactly the same as they were before, stiff as wooden soldiers. Even Mr. Appleby's cat was no further up the tree, and Ralph was no closer to catching him. "Mom?" No reply. Albert raised his voice. "Mom!" "Albert!" her voice called back. Albert smiled and turned quickly into Mr. Appleby's driveway. As he headed up the drive, he could hear his mother calling his name again. Albert hurried toward the garden. He rode right through the lower branches of the big honeysuckle bush and bounced along the path into the workshed. The clatter of the engine suddenly stopped. "Albert!" His mother's voice was loud and clear as she strode across the lawn. Mr. Appleby hurried out of the shed. "Mom," Albert cried, "look at the car Mr. Appleby made just for me. I can drive it all by myself." He turned the wooden key back and forth. He stepped on the gas pedal. Clack, clack. Nothing happened. Albert's mother walked over to the car. "Oh, it's a wonderful toy," she said as she reached for his hand. "But it's time for you to get some rest now." Albert looked at Mr. Appleby in disbelief. As he stood, a tiny red bead fell from his lap and rolled down the drive. "Hey, it's one of the apples from my wooden town." three stood and watched as the little wooden bead bounced right out of sight. "Never mind, Albert," said Mr. Appleby. "There's plenty more where that came from. Drive over any time and get another." Albert grinned from ear to ear as he got back in behind the wheel of the beautiful wooden car. Albert's mother gave him a push, and the two of them bumped right across the lawn. As Albert turned to wave, he saw Mr. Appleby reach through the bottom branches of the honeysuckle bush. Out came a shiny red apple. "Goodbye," Albert hollered. Mr. Appleby winked and took a big bite. That's the end. See you next time.